Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for your initial statements and your responses thus far. Because of a change in the committee's schedule yesterday, I was not able to be here for a part of it that I expected to be, and I want to take a minute or two of my valuable questioning time to say something. And it is that I am concerned about the total preoccupation on intelligence failures. And that's the headlines, of course, and that's what was the theme of all day yesterday and in general. Of course, there are inadequacies and gaps and deficiencies in intelligence collection analysis. We all understand that very well. But what is not being focused upon are the failures in the law enforcement agencies and the other entities that could have averted a terrorist act and are needed to avert future terrorist acts. It is I have been amazed thus far to find that there seems to have been no place in the federal government where there was a responsibility for examining all the potential terrorist scenarios and then taking plans to avoid them with the domestic agencies. I think most citizens would have assumed that capacity existed. I certainly, with some knowledge of the federal structure, would have expected it existed. It apparently didn't. It doesn't take too much imagination, it seems to me, that to imagine that a commercial airliner would be used as a flying bomb. And we know from the committee's report yesterday there were many indications that this was being considered by al-Qaeda. Tom Clancy had it as a part of one of his books with the airliner being crashed into the Capitol Dome. And if it wasn't specifically assigned to an entity or an interagency group, it looks like it would have been done in the National Security Council. Now we have a Homeland Security Director, and we know where the responsibility is placed and will be developed. Gentlemen, I want to focus first on, I guess, you, Secretary Armitage. I'm generally aware of the recommendations for changes of the intelligence agencies within the Department of Defense. But looking at the State Department's own internal intelligence capacity, the INR, how do you think it interfaces? How has it interfaced, in fact, with the other collectors and analytical capabilities of the federal government? And what changes have been made, or would you contemplate, would you recommend, Secretary Armitage?
Thank you. In INR, we are primarily and almost exclusively involved in analysis and not in go out and gleaning intelligence. And I believe your own excellent staff of this committee has determined that much of the analysis in INR was pretty damn good. Number one. Number two, that means that primarily it's limited by the information in. So one might contemplate whether the state itself wants to have a larger, sort of more active role in the gleaning of intelligence. Now, primarily the intelligence we get is open source or for comments of one embassy officer with some host country official or another. And the other is gleaned from open sources, and Paul was careful and I think right to draw our attention to that. We have put both INR and DS, diplomatic security agents, with the Counterterrorism Center. This is good at breaking down the culture. It also helps us a bit. We have had before 9/11 and continue now to have FBI officers who serve in our Counterterrorism Center. So I think in the main, I've got to do a little more with the budget for INR because, as I said, we've now got 10 analysts strictly devoted to terrorism, which is up from before, but it's clearly not sufficient. But the analysis they've given was, I think, judged by your own commissioners to be pretty much on the mark, sir.
Thank you. Secretary Wolfowitz, you generally quote the President in the conclusions of your testimony this morning as saying that every element of national power must be used against the terrorist, military, law enforcement, diplomatic, intelligence, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. Looking back at the small boat attack on the USS Cole in the previous administration, but looking back at it and determining what was done at that point or what was not done, why well, first of all, was there a military response plan to respond to the attack on the USS Cole? And if not, why not? Was there an expectation that the problems of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban would be handled by the intelligence agencies or covert operations? Why was there no attack, and was there any military planning to respond to the USS Cole attack?
Congressman, I can't tell you what happened in the immediate aftermath of the attack. I can tell you that 6 months later, when we came into office, or when Secretary Armitage and I came into office, it was clear that terrorism had to be dealt with in a different way. It's not a law enforcement problem, and it can't be dealt with simply by retaliating against individual acts of terrorism. As we said earlier, we understood that this was an entity that was at war with us, and that taking them on involved something more than just an individual retaliatory response. That wasn't going to stop the problem. You, I think, expressed your puzzlement, and undoubtedly the puzzlement of many Americans, at why the FBI didn't provide some of this information. In fairness to the FBI, it ought to be pointed out that for very good, substantial reasons, they are not supposed to report information on Americans to intelligence agencies. This is an issue we've got to confront now, but they weren't. It's not that they were stupid. They're there under a different set of rules that require people to be very careful about information that can be prosecuted. But if I could, just 2 points. We're not going to win this war on defense, no matter how good our intelligence is. We've got to go on offense, and offense does not just mean a one-off military retaliation. It means the kind of campaign that we're conducting now against terrorism. It means a war.
Secretary Wolfowitz, we're well aware of the limitations properly imposed upon the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but there is no excuse whatsoever for the failure to communicate what the agents in the Phoenix office had uncovered, which therefore caused a failure to respond properly to the agents in the Minneapolis field office. There's an absolute failure in that bureaucracy and an information technology failure, to say the least. And so it's important we don't divert by telling us that this is not in their area of responsibility from their real failures in this instance. And of course, yesterday, the family witnesses pointed out to us about the 11 minutes or perhaps 12 minutes that seemed to take place in FAA control New York after they knew that the second airliner was headed for the second tower, but no alert was given to the Port Authority. I would like Secretary Armitage, if you would respond to this question. Do you feel that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has contributed to the rise of Al-Qaeda?
No, Senator.
I would say to you that many people believe that it does, and many people in the Middle East, more importantly, believe that it does.
That's a different question.
And then, in light of this attitude of so many people living in the Middle East, and indeed some of our citizens, what is the State Department's role to correct errors in perception, I guess we'll put it that way, or to change their attitude about the United States and their attitude about the terrorists?
I know you understand this explicitly, but I want to make the point that Osama bin Laden was planning these attacks at a time when the Israeli-Palestinian question was in a much more benign state, when our president was meeting here at Camp David, and they're very close to a resolution. So I do not buy the argument that our policy in the Middle East is responsible for al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. And it was only laterally, it was only after these World Trade Center attacks that Osama bin Laden could even say the word Palestinian out loud publicly. Now, the question of what should we do to fix it, I think we are trying to work a very difficult equation to address a humanitarian situation, particularly with in the occupied territories, to work with our closest ally, the government of Israel, who even today suffered yet again from terrorism, and finally to have a political change in the Palestinian Authority that will allow the Palestinians to be governed by the type of government people deserve. And that's all ongoing, and that was the subject of Secretary Powell's meeting yesterday in New York, 2 days ago, with the quartet.
Secretary Armitage, would you speak to the role of the public diplomacy that would have an impact upon attitudes of the population of the Middle East, particularly the Arab countries?
Yeah, this is an area, and we've done historically, we know now, a bad job. The Secretary brought in Charlotte Beers to try to really address this, and I'm delighted that particularly Frank Wolf's Appropriations Committee in the first instance has been so supportive to give us the resources for this. But we had to learn what the questions to ask were before we could start addressing them. And I think Charlotte Beers has done that, and we're off and running in the Middle East. And I think over time, you'll be able to judge whether we've been effective or not. I don't think I can judge that today.
It's an important priority. We wish you well in this respect, and much success.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask both of you if you would give us your own observations about the weaknesses that you have observed with regard to intelligence collection and analysis. And let me just stipulate, we all seem to agree that there's an inadequacy of human intelligence and a risk aversion perhaps in some of the people involved in human, which we're trying to address. But setting that aside, what other kinds of weaknesses have you seen in your experience in government, going back over some years now and continuing to this day, in the intelligence collection analysis function of the federal government? And of course, I'm talking about foreign intelligence collection.
I think that the questions of human intelligence and agents and all of that, this committee, both the House and the Senate, have delved into it at great length. But a point that's always bothered me was alluded to by Paul, and that is that in the intelligence community, in the analysis business, which is where I am, I'm the consumer, it's very rare that we get the one-off voice or the dissident voice that Paul was talking about. For a policymaker, a dissonant voice is very helpful either to confirm what you're already thinking or to really open up a new area, and this is not generally done. And if I had to say the one biggest weakness in the analysis area, I would say that's it. Second, it's the way analysis in the intelligence community is generally put forward, and it's related, and that is consensus.
We found, for example, a dissident voice in the DIA that seemed to be discouraged from being able to present his viewpoints. And I would guess that's a common problem. So you bring up an interesting point, and how do we protect that? How do we make sure that those dissident voices that sometimes have part of the answer or the answer are heard?
I must say, I remember when Director Gates was the deputy director, I remember vividly, I was in the Pentagon, he sent down something on Africa, and it had to do with the community view on AIDS, HIV/AIDS in Africa. And he said, I want to give you the view of one analyst. It is not a community product, which was dramatically different, and by the way, dramatically correct, as we've seen by the virulence of the spread of AIDS. And that's the kind of thing that just has to be encouraged.
Secretary Wolfowitz, would you like to focus in on your observations and any weaknesses other than the human, which we could probably agree on?
I really would just reinforce this observation about the need to get alternative views up, because almost everything that's important here is shrouded in ambiguity and uncertainty. There's nothing that's flat, black and white. And there is, I think, a tendency to want to get things scrubbed out, to get the differences eliminated. I remember the first national intelligence estimate I ever read, which I'm embarrassed to say was nearly 30 years ago, in which it was on the critical issue of Soviet strategic capabilities, and I believe it was the Director of Central Intelligence, in forwarding the report, said very proudly what a great job these people had done in producing a report on such an important subject without a single footnote, in other words, without a single voice of disagreement. And I was just appalled. I mean, I thought, how can you possibly address a subject of that importance without differences? So I think get those differences up on the table, get the raw information up a little bit faster. Understandably, some of it's going to be wrong, and you don't want people rushing off and taking precipitous actions based on raw intelligence. But I think there's a tendency to hoard stuff too long and to keep it in compartments.
Thank you. I want to ask both of you, are there any groups any groups other than Al-Qaeda, capable of or seriously considering attacking the United States today? And I'm talking about the homeland.
I think in terms of capability and virulence, Hezbollah certainly is capable. They have thus far confined themselves in the main to Central and South America and, of course, the Middle East. But capability, they could do it.
It's absolutely right, and intentions are one of those things that if you want any precision on, you'll almost never get it. If you reject the evidence that comes from overt expressions of hostility, then you'll be taken by surprise every time.
Is there any other entity you would suggest other than Hezbollah at this point? Or make general reference to, if you don't
No, other than to make the obvious point that there are a number of groups in the so-called network, that is Al-Qaeda, whose intentions are clearly to harm Americans. They've said it, they do it, they write it, whether it's Jamiat Islama or any others. So I don't have direct information that they're targeting the United States, but they're certainly intent on targeting U.S. interests.
Congressman, we don't have that kind of precise information about what groups are there. This group that calls itself the Islamic Movement for Change, that sent a threatening letter to our embassy in Saudi Arabia in the spring of 1995 and then claimed credit for the attack in Riyadh in the fall of 1995, has never been identified. We don't know what countries or what groups have sleeper cells buried around the world now. We know what people have capabilities, and we know what people have declared hostile intentions toward us. And as I go back to Secretary Rumsfeld's point, those are the dots, and if you want to wait until they're connected, you're going to wait until something terrible happens.
Both of you have experience beyond your current capacity and previous roles in the administrations. Both of you have held important roles in the Department of Defense, and one continues today, of course. What do you think the state of affairs is with respect to our allies and their ability to provide intelligence to us? Have we is there progress yet to be made in that respect?
Well, first of all, the difference between September 10th and September 12th in this regard is night and day. And that includes more than just intelligence. It's also in the terrorist financing. We stood up the terrorist financing back in May, the tracking center. But after the tragedy, people came aboard. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And I say that with complete assurance, because we don't know what we don't know from these countries, and we sometimes find it very surprising that we have some information which turns out to be true, and we take it to host countries and they say, oh yeah, well, we knew about that, we neglected to tell you, we forgot to tell you. So there's a lot of work still to be done.
I just add very briefly, our cooperation with our allies improved dramatically after September 11th. Our cooperation with unfriendly countries improved dramatically after the fall of the Taliban.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're called for a vote, and so I'll just terminate at this point.